We're going to talk a little bit about weld discontinuities, what causes some of them, and how you can avoid them. And I'm going to reference my API 1104 codebook. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because each codebook kind of has their own little language. So some things are called different things in different codebooks. For example, in 1104 or pipe welder lingo, high-low in the pipe world is the misalignment of the bevels in the structure. So with that being said, I'm going to go right into this book and just go right down the list, and I have examples to show you. Now this piece is still hot. Yep, that's still hot. We talk about incomplete penetration all the time. On a full penetration weld, especially in pipe welds, you have root bead on the inside. What IP is referencing is that root bead kind of missing. So you don't have complete or full penetration to the outside. And it looks kind of like that. So you got a full root bead here. Now the root bead's not pretty. You got a full root bead right here, and then there's nothing. You can see the bottom of the bevel there. That's IP. There is a certain amount that is allowed depending on the code that you're welding to. But for the most part, if you see it, it's not good. IP is due to tight space, inadequate amount of heat, be a high, or your root face is a little high, or your land, or a combination thereof. So make sure your land is adequate, but not too fat. You got to make sure your space is right. You got to make sure your heat is right. If you notice anything that changes, if you notice anything in the root bead when you're running your root, it starts to get quiet on the inside of the pipe, you know that you're not getting quite the penetration you want. So be aware of that. But that's IP. The second one I do want to talk about is, in fact, high-low. Bevel misalignment, or whatever the hell you want to call it. I'm going to call it high-low because that's what I've called it since forever. High-low is when your two pieces don't quite match up, kind of like that. Again, there is a certain amount that is allowed depending on the codebook that you're referring to. But for example, there's been a couple companies that I've worked for that they don't allow barely any. They allow 32nd of an inch. That's it. So you got to really be careful. High-low can cause all sorts of problems. It can cause IP. It can also cause lack of fusion in the bevel, which we'll talk about. It can also cause, it's also stress risers. So when you're adding pressure to a pipe, any sharp curve or point, which would be like right here, that sharp edge right there, if that weld is going to fail, it will fail right there because that is its highest point of stress. It's concentrated in one spot. That's why everything needs to be round and even and consistent. But again, pipe's not perfect, and neither is plate or structure or anything like that. So there is a tolerance, it's just a matter of how much. So IF, or incomplete fusion, is much like IP, only instead of being on the root, it is kind of inside the weld. It can also be on the surface of the weld, but typically you would see it in the weld in an X-ray. IF is lack of fusion between the piece you're welding on and your weld metal. It's just a void, a gap. It's very easy to see in X-ray. And usually what causes that is that your metal that you're welding on isn't clean enough. There's some grease or oils left over that didn't burn off. And you just weld right over it and the weld doesn't melt to it. It just kind of stays at its own little spot. There's no slag in there. It's just a void, just a gap. It could also be bad rod angle. Your amperage could also be too low for what you're welding on. Make sure your heat's high enough. Make sure your metal's clean enough. Focus when you're watching your puddle as you're welding what's going on, because it is, you can see it when it happens. It's quick, but you can see it. But that's IF. Incomplete fusion can also be kind of known as cold lap. It's pretty close to the same thing. I'm not going to get into the details as to what's what unless somebody's really interested. But that's the basic idea. So the other one that's big in a full penetration weld is what we call burn through. This is something that welders talk about a lot. This is something that weld inspectors don't want to see a lot. And burn through looks just like that little spot where I'm pointing at. Now what happens there is in the root bead, the welder will start welding and his keyhole gets too wide and he can't fill it in. And it just keeps getting wider and wider and he keeps filling it in. He finally skips over it, continues over, then he goes back and tries to fix it. Well, he doesn't fix it properly and he leaves that little eye right there. That eye will show up in an x-ray as like a really dark spot. And that's because the density is not near enough. That's the best way for me to explain it. I wish I could explain it better than that. I wish I had some x-rays to show you. But burn through is not a good thing to see in an x-ray. As a matter of fact, just about every test that I've taken for a company, burn through was not allowed on the test. There's some that's allowed in the field. So in 1104 rules, you're allowed 1/4 inch size burn through 12 inches of linear weld. Still allowed. But on the test, you weren't allowed any. If the inspector even heard burn through, he'd kick you out. Be mindful of that. But it happens. So sometimes if you have a helper, the helper doesn't quite grind down the land or grinds down the land a little too much, you get down and you're running your heat, you don't recognize it, and you get to a thin spot and all of a sudden it just blows wide open on you. Typically burn through happens when you're running too hot for the piece you're welding on. And it opens up, you try to fill it in, it doesn't work, you keep going. And you come back and try and fix it. Basically it's an inadequate repair on your own root. There is a way to fix a burn through without it showing up on x-ray. It takes a lot of time and a lot of practice, but it's possible. I've done it myself. And the best way to avoid it is to just be mindful of what you're welding and what your heat is. And if your keyhole gets too big and you recognize it getting too big, don't keep trying to fill it in. Either stop, turn your heat down and restart, or get past it and come back to it. If you sit there and try and fill it, it gets too big, it ends up being a bunch of issues. Now we'll get into the stuff that's more common. Slag inclusions. Now, slag inclusions are basically what it sounds like. You got slag stuck in the metal. Here is a beautiful example of a slag inclusion right there. Now you can't always see them. They might be under the weld, or that's there, I didn't see it, and then I weld back over it and cover it up. An x-ray, it shows up as a dark line. What happens is the slag gets behind the weld and sits there and doesn't burn off. And it just keeps the weld away from the metal. You got this dark spot, you break. You saw in the neck break video that I did where I was breaking apart some 7018 that I welded that was soaked. There's a bunch of dark spots in there, that was all slag inclusions. So there's a certain amount that's allowed, but you're not allowed a lot. Best thing to do there is you got to keep your slag away from the puddle. You got to make sure you clean off your welds when you're done. Make sure all the slag's out of there so when you go back over it, you're not welding over the slag. Because people will say all the time, they'll just burn that out. Not really. So undercut is where, when you're welding, you cut metal out of your base metal, but you don't replace it with weld metal. Whether it's bad rod angle or you just didn't spend enough time, whatever. But you can see right here, that's undercut. You see how it's catching? Now again, there's a certain amount that's allowed depending on your code. Typically I find undercut to be bad rod angle or way too much heat. So this was a horizontal weld, if you can't tell. And if I'm straight in the workpiece like this, all the metal wants to do is just fall down. So it's really hard to keep the metal up long enough for it to stay put. So typically when I'm running a horizontal weld, especially with 7018 or 6013, my rod angle is like this to keep the arc force up, keep that weld up there a little bit. And of course I'm running way too slow here too, so it'd speed up. But that's almost every time, that's what I find is undercut is caused by bad rod angle. Again, or way too much heat. Now the last one we will talk about is porosity. For some reason, I try to reproduce it and I just can't. But then I'll be out in the field and it shows up randomly. But porosity is when atmosphere gets to the weld and contaminates it, puts little air bubbles in it. The weld has to be protected by some sort of inert gas or slag or combination thereof. When we stick weld, we're melting the flux, which is that powder coating, off the rod and creating slag, which protects the weld, and then also a shielding gas of sorts. So porosity can happen for a number of different reasons, and sometimes it's unpredictable. You know, if you get a gust of wind that blows away all the shielding gas that you have, that can cause porosity. Sometimes you get a bad rod, that can cause porosity. Cold starts, hot stops, cold stops, just because the metal's not cooperating with you sometimes. Oils, dirt, and grease on the metal and stuff like that. It's a whole bunch of things can cause porosity, and it's very important to be very aware of what you're doing. So the best example I have, because I couldn't create anything more obvious for some reason, is right there at my start. Those holes are porosity spots. Now there's all different types of porosities, cluster porosity and all the other ones that I'm just not going to get into because it's not, for most people it's not necessary. Just know that you see spots in your weld, that's bad, and you don't always see it. Sometimes it's hiding underneath the weld and you don't see it until it gets x-rayed and you go, what the, you know. So there is a certain amount that's allowed. Again, they're a little bit more lenient with porosity, at least in 1104. But still, too much is not okay. And the way to fix it is important. You can't just weld over it. You can't just burn it out. Porosity doesn't get burned out. If you weld over porosity, you can create more porosity. You can spread it out throughout the weld. Best thing to do is to grind the porosity out until you don't see it anymore, and then weld that spot back over it. But that's it. That's my lesson for today. Working on a couple big projects right now. There is a project that I have coming up that you guys will probably see really soon. So stay tuned, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I'll see you later.